In the winter of 1883, a bell founder's journeyman named George Pritchard was contracted to assist with the removal of 3 bronze bells from the tower of St. Cuthbert's Church in Wells, Somerset, bells that the parish vestry had voted to replace with a new ring of 6 after a survey declared them structurally compromised. Pritchard was 33 years old and had worked for the foundry of John Taylor and Company in Loughborough for 9 years, assisting with the casting, tuning, and installation of bells across England. He had handled hundreds of bells. He had never handled bells like these. He arrived in Wells on a Tuesday evening and was told the work would begin the following morning. At 6 o'clock that next morning, the vestry clerk arrived at his lodgings and told him the work had been moved to that night. No reason was given. At 11 o'clock, by lantern, with a crew of 4 local laborers who had been told nothing about what they were removing, he began the extraction. The largest of the 3 bells was cast bronze, approximately 4 feet in diameter at the rim, and bore no inscription, which was unusual, as bells of its apparent age invariably carried the name of the founder, the date, and often a dedication. Its surface was not decorated. Its bronze was a color Pritchard had not seen in any bell he had worked with, not the warm reddish-brown of aged English bronze, but a gray-green that suggested an alloy composition he could not identify by sight. He attempted to read its wall thickness with his gauge before it was crated. The wall was thinner than any bell of comparable diameter he had encountered, thin enough that he expected, by every technical measure he had been trained on, that the bell would produce a shallow and unsatisfactory tone. He struck it once with his installation mallet before the vestry clerk stopped him. The sound it produced was not shallow. It was the deepest note he had ever heard from a bell of that size, and it did not decay the way a bell's sound decays. It continued. He counted 17 seconds before the vestry clerk told the crew to begin crating. The parish records of St. Cuthbert's Church in Wells, held at the Somerset Heritage Centre in Taunton, contain vestry meeting minutes for 1882 and 1883, recording the decision to replace the 3 bells, the survey report declaring them structurally compromised, and the contract with the new bell foundry. The records do not mention George Pritchard. They do not mention John Taylor and Company. They do not mention a nighttime removal, or any reason why the removal was conducted after dark rather than during the day. The disposal of the 3 old bells, where they went after removal, is recorded in the vestry minutes as a single line, old bells disposed of per arrangement with the Archdeaconry. The Archdeaconry of Wells has no record of any arrangement regarding the St. Cuthbert's bells in 1883. The bells are not listed in any subsequent sale record, any foundry receipt for returned metal, or any church inventory within the Diocese of Bath and Wells. They were removed on a Wednesday night in January 1883 and have no documented existence after that date. Pritchard was not a man easily impressed by bells. He had spent 9 years in one of the finest bell foundries in England, had worked alongside men who had spent their entire careers in the industry, and had developed a professional ear for the acoustic properties of cast metal that most people would never possess. He knew, from the moment his mallet touched the largest bell's rim, that what he was hearing was not a product of conventional bell founding. The sustain was wrong. Not wrong as in defective, wrong as in impossible, by the physics of cast bronze as he understood them. A bell's tone decays because the metal's internal vibration dissipates. What he heard did not dissipate in 17 seconds. It held. He wrote about it once, in a letter to his foundry supervisor dated 3 weeks after the Wells job, asking whether his supervisor had any technical knowledge of bronze alloy compositions that could produce the sustain he had observed. The letter is in the John Taylor and Company archive, held at the Loughborough University Library under an industrial records accession. His supervisor's written response, also in the archive, says only that the Wells bells were old, and that old bells sometimes behaved unexpectedly, and that Pritchard should not trouble himself about it. He never raised the question again. He continued at the foundry until 1901, retired, and died in 1919. The letter is accessible. The bells are not. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what George Pritchard heard in that church tower in Wells, we have to go back, not just to the bells of English parish churches, and not just to the foundries that cast them. We have to go back to a question that the official history of bell acoustics has never asked in any public forum: what the bells that were replaced during the Great Victorian Church Restoration campaigns of the 1850s through 1890s were actually producing, and why the institutional church, the Church of England, the Diocese of Bath and Wells, the College of Ringers, oversaw the systematic removal of the oldest bells in England with a thoroughness that the Restoration narrative does not fully explain. The official history of Victorian church restoration presents the replacement of pre-Reformation bells as a reasonable response to structural deterioration and improved foundry technology. Old bells were cracked, out of tune by modern standards, potentially dangerous to their towers. New bells produced a superior ring. This is credible as far as it goes. It does not account for the pattern. The bells condemned during the Victorian campaigns were not, in the majority of documented cases, cracked. The surveys that condemned them were conducted by surveyors working under Archidiaconal Commission, appointed by the same institutional structure that controlled the replacements. Architectural historians who have examined the Victorian Restoration in detail have noted, with visible discomfort, that the condemnation surveys were sometimes inconsistent with the physical condition described by the bell founders called in to remove them. The founders knew bells. Several left records of their professional disagreement with the surveys. A bell hanger named Thomas Edgeworth, who worked on bell restoration projects across the West Country from 1862 to 1891, kept a professional diary in which he recorded his assessment of every bell he handled. The diary is held at the Bristol Record Office under a private donation accession. In 11 separate entries across his career, Edgeworth records bells that had been condemned by Archidiaconal Survey and that he, upon physical examination, assessed as structurally sound. In 4 of those 11 cases, he notes that the condemned bells had an acoustic characteristic he describes as a secondary tone, a sustained undertone that persisted after the principal note had begun to decay, and that he could hear only when standing directly beneath the bell in the tower, not from the nave or the churchyard. He did not know what produced the secondary tone. He wrote in one entry, in 1873, that he had asked a colleague with more experience whether the tone was known and had been told it was a feature of certain old castings that had never been reproduced in modern founding practice, and that no one he spoke to could explain. Of the 11 bells he assessed as sound, but which were condemned and removed, 10 were replaced. The 11th was retained after Edgeworth's written objection was submitted to the vestry. His objection is referenced in the vestry minutes of St. Andrew's Church in Taunton, dated April 1877. The bell he objected to saving is still in that tower. It has not been the subject of any published acoustic study. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the bells removed during the Victorian church restoration campaigns, particularly those dating from before 1550, the pre-Reformation period, possessed acoustic properties that were not incidental to their design, that those properties were understood by whoever commissioned their original casting, and that the institutional church's campaign to replace them with modern rings was not primarily motivated by the structural and harmonic concerns the official record describes. What independent acoustic researchers have found in the handful of pre-Reformation bells that survived the Victorian period is that their sustained characteristics are anomalous by the standards of cast bronze acoustics. The decay curves are slower than the physics of the material should allow. The secondary tones that Edgeworth noted, the undertones audible only beneath the bell, not from the nave or the churchyard, fall in the surviving bells that have been measured within frequency ranges that have documented physiological effects on the human nervous system, not harmful effects, specific effects. The frequency ranges that produce these effects in laboratory conditions are also, in at least 3 cases in the published scientific literature, the ranges associated with states of altered neurological coherence, the focused, receptive state that every religious tradition across every culture has sought to induce through ritual. The old bells were not making sound for the ears, they were making sound for the body, and whoever removed them in the darkness of a winter night in 1883 and in hundreds of similar operations across England in the decades before and after knew the difference. York, 1857, the vestry of All Saints' Church on Pavement, voted to remove and replace 2 pre-Reformation bells following an archidiaconal survey. The bell hanger contracted for the removal, a man named Samuel Cope, wrote in his account book that one of the 2 bells was the finest casting he had ever worked with, wall thickness consistent, bronze of unusual quality, no visible structural defect of any kind. He recorded this observation, charged his day rate, and removed it. Cope's account book is in the York Minster Archive under a bell restoration accession. The observation is on page 44. It has not been cited in any published history of All Saints' Pavement. Gloucester, 1869, the cathedral chapter removed 3 ancient bells from St. Mary de Crypt over 2 nights. On the second morning, the Gloucester Journal ran a brief item reporting that residents of Southgate Street had described an unusual sound during the night. A sustained low tone they said they had felt through their walls as much as heard. The item ran once. No follow-up was published. It is on page 3 of the August 14 edition in the Gloucestershire Archives. It has not been cited in any history of St. Mary de Crypt or any account of the chapter's 1869 restoration decisions. Lincoln, 1874. A cathedral maintenance worker named Edwin Marsh filed a written report with the cathedral chapter describing an incident during the removal of 4 pre-Reformation bells from the cathedral's southwest tower. During the lowering of the second bell, the lowering rope slipped, and the bell struck the tower floor at an angle, producing a sound that Marsh described as causing every member of the removal crew to stop working simultaneously and stand still for an estimated 2 minutes without speaking or moving. He described the sensation as a pressure rather than a sound, something felt in the chest and the base of the skull. When the men resumed work they were all, he wrote, shaking. The chapter acknowledged Marsh's report. Their written response is in the Lincoln Cathedral Archive. It states that the incident was noted and that no further action was required. The bell whose sound produced this response was removed from the cathedral, and its disposal, like the Wells bells 30 years later, is recorded as carried out per arrangement. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes George Pritchard's letter different from every other account of anomalous bell acoustics in the Victorian Restoration record. In 1931, 48 years after the St. Cuthbert's bells were removed, an acoustic researcher named Dr. Frederick Howe, a lecturer in applied physics at the University of Bristol, learned of the Wells incident through a colleague who had read Pritchard's letter in the Taylor and Company archive. Howe was not a historian. He was a physicist interested in the acoustic properties of large bronze castings, and he had been working for 3 years on a hypothesis about the relationship between bell wall thickness and low-frequency sustain. Pritchard's description of a bell thinner than standard, producing a deeper and longer tone than standard was, to Howe, not a curiosity. It was a data point that contradicted the established acoustic model in a specific and testable way. He wrote to the Somerset Heritage Center requesting any surviving documentation about the Wells bells. He received the vestry minutes and the Archdeaconry non-record, which told him nothing about the bell's physical composition. He wrote to the Diocese of Bath and Wells requesting any further documentation of the bell's disposal. The diocese responded that no records of the disposal existed beyond the vestry minutes. He applied to the Worshipful Company of Bell Founders in London for any historical records of unusual bronze alloy compositions in pre-Reformation English bells. The company's librarian wrote back that no such records existed in their holdings. He published a paper in 1932 in the Journal of the Acoustical Society asking whether any surviving pre-Reformation bells in English parish churches had been subjected to alloy analysis. The paper received 2 responses, neither of them from church institutions. It received no institutional response from the Church of England, the Bell Founders Company, or any diocesan archive. Howe continued his research for 4 more years before his death in 1936. His unpublished notes are in the special collections of the University of Bristol Library, donated by his wife in 1941. A researcher who examined them in 2003 found extensive correspondence in which church institutions, diocesan records offices, and Bell Foundry archives uniformly declined to provide information about the composition or disposal of pre-Reformation bells removed during the Victorian period. The Church of England has never adequately addressed several specific questions about the bell removals of the Victorian Restoration campaigns. It has never explained why the disposal of the St. Cuthbert's Wells bells, 3 items removed from a registered church under a documented contract, has no record beyond a single line referring to an archdeaconry arrangement that the archdeaconry denies. It is never explained why Thomas Edgeworth's professional assessments, which found 11 condemned bells to be structurally sound, were disregarded in 10 of 11 cases by institutional bodies that lacked his technical qualifications. It has never explained why the Gloucester Journal's report of residents experiencing the sound of a removed bell as a physical sensation, a documented contemporary newspaper account, has never been referenced in any institutional history of the 1869 chapter restoration decisions. Why were the Wells bells removed at 11 o'clock at night rather than during the day, when every practical consideration of logistics and labor would favor daytime work? Why did the bell that Lincoln Cathedral's maintenance worker described as causing an entire crew to stop moving for 2 minutes get disposed of, like every other anomalous bell in this record, per arrangement, with no trace of where it went? Why has no pre-Reformation English bell been subjected to a published alloy analysis in the 140 years since the Victorian Restoration campaigns removed the majority of them from their towers? Why, if there is nothing to find, has no one looked? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a journeyman's letter in a Loughborough archive, a bell hanger's diary at the Bristol Record Office, with 11 entries describing bells condemned by surveyors who lacked his expertise, a newspaper item about a sound felt through walls, a cathedral maintenance report about a crew that stopped moving, and 4 years of an acoustic researcher's correspondence in which every institution he approached declined to help, and a pattern of institutional response across the Church of England, multiple dioceses, the Bell Founders Company, and several cathedral chapters, that in every case treated the old bells as something whose composition could not be discussed and whose destination could not be recorded. For the 36 years between the Wells job in 1883 and his death in 1919, Pritchard continued at John Taylor and Company. He never again encountered anything like the 3 bells he had removed by lantern light from that Somerset tower. He did not write again about what he had heard. He was a craftsman with a craftsman's precision. He had heard something that did not match his understanding of what bronze could do, had wanted to know why, and the industry he had worked in for 22 years had told him not to trouble himself about it. He accepted that. The sound he had heard, the note that did not decay for 17 seconds from a bell too thin to produce it, went with him into 36 more years of professional life without any technical explanation arriving, and then out of living memory entirely, into a letter in an archive that a researcher has to know to look for. The bell is gone. Whatever tower it hung in before St. Cuthbert's, wherever it came from before the parish vestry decided in 1882 that it was structurally compromised, whatever process produced a bronze gray-green enough and thin enough and dense enough to sustain a note for 17 seconds, none of that is in any record. The crate it was packed into on a January night in 1883 went somewhere under an archdeaconry arrangement and has not been seen since. But the sound was witnessed. A man who knew bells, who had spent 9 years learning what bronze does when you strike it, stood beneath it in a lantern-lit tower and listened to it do something he had no framework for. He counted the seconds. He wrote them down. He asked one question and received one dismissal and never asked again. The seconds are in the archive in Loughborough, in a letter addressed to a supervisor who told him not to trouble himself. 17 of them. Still there. The official history tells us that the Victorian church restoration campaigns improved English bell towers by replacing deteriorated old rings with scientifically tuned modern ones. What the bellhanger's diary and the journeyman's letter and the newspaper item and the cathedral maintenance report tell us is that some of what was removed during those campaigns was not deteriorated, was not out of tune by any standard its contemporaries understood, and produced sounds that the men who handled it wrote down in careful professional language because they could not explain them and could not forget them. The church removed those bells at night and disposed of them per arrangement and kept no record of where they went. Whatever they were doing in those towers for the centuries before the restorers came, they have not been doing it since. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when you take it down from a tower. It disappears when you stop asking where they took it. Next week I am following a thread that connects the St. Cuthbert's Wells removal to a foundry assay record filed with the Worshipful Company of Bell Founders in London in 1841, 42 years before the Wells bells were removed. The assay was conducted on a fragment of an ancient bell brought in by a churchwarden from a Wiltshire parish whose name is redacted in the record. The assay found a bronze composition that the company's assayer described as containing a proportion of an unidentified metal constituent he could not match to any known alloy specification. He submitted the fragment for further analysis. The company's minutes record the submission. They do not record the result. The assay record exists. The result does not.